Hello everyone. So today we are going to start with week 10 of our lecture. So in this lecture, we are going to cover the topic on coping with environmental threat and eco-anxiety, our psychological response to climate change. So in this domain, what we are going to do, we are going to cover some of the theories, some of the research work, and also some of the interventions that can be planned on eco-anxiety, and also generally to cover how to cope with health-related hazards, particularly well-being related hazards, which are embedded within climate change perceptions and climate change impacts. So before we start with the lecture for today, let's start with the land acknowledgement. So I would like to begin today's lecture by acknowledging that the land on which I'm based, it's in the Greater Vancouver area, and our campus in Burnaby, the SFU Burnaby campus, is located on the unceded traditional territories of Coquitlam, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. As Canadians, we must acknowledge that this country was built on the legacy of colonization, racism, displacement of Indigenous peoples. I would also like to acknowledge that in this session, particularly when we talk about health and well-being related impacts, there are particularly also those communities that have been more negatively impacted because of climate change related impacts compared to other communities, particularly Indigenous peoples. So whenever we are working on these issues, it is important to acknowledge, and it's also important to work with these communities. In addition to that, I would also like to acknowledge that because of colonization in this country and in many other countries, the land related impacts of Indigenous people, they have been really much more negative compared to many other places. Also, it is important to acknowledge that my own background and my own history as a South Asian woman, as a woman of Punjabi heritage, it also limits some of my own experiences in certain ways that I might not be able to fully understand some of these issues, and particularly how they impact some of the other communities. So with that, let's begin today's lesson. So generally, the topic that we are going to cover today, it's coping with environmental threat and eco-anxiety, and our psychological response to climate change. We know that in the recent years, this is one of those things that have been heavily debated, discussed, and presented in the media, which also means that many of us have been exposed to this quite a lot, leading to multiple negative well-being related impacts. So not only directly, but also indirectly, even if some of the people did not experience intense heat waves, or flooding related events, or any other climate related direct or indirect impacts. Nonetheless, many of us have been able to see some of these impacts happening on other populations, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere. So in one way or another, all of us, we have been exposed to many of these elements, which have in one way or another impacted many of us. Therefore, it is important to talk about what are these environmental threats, how they are leading to certain kinds of well-being related negative influences on people, and then how, as psychologists or as students of psychology, or people who work with multiple communities, or people who have been working as climate activists, or who would personally want to change their own attitudes and behaviors about climate change, how do we incorporate some of these learnings, some of this knowledge, and also some of this research into our own everyday lives? So based on that, this lecture is going to cover some of these learnings, Also, we know that in the recent years, the fear of climate change, it threatens core understanding and current social systems as well. As we have discussed in our previous lectures and in our previous discussions, we know that these impacts and these understanding of climate change and how they translate into different types of lifestyles from many communities and people, they vary across the global north and the global south as well. We also know that the potential loss of ontological understanding in many communities have also been under the influence of climate-related impacts. So, for example, previously, when some of the things, they were local knowledge for some of the communities, that has also been eroded because of climate-related events, particularly the ones that are erratic, particularly the ones that have really damaged our communities in multiple ways. So in this lecture, we are going to discuss some of these events, also how they translate into health-related hazards, particularly well-being related hazards. So one of the really interesting thing that we have recently seen, particularly at COP26, we have been more aware than ever before about many of the Pacific Island nations where these impacts are already folding to a very huge level. And the people or the leadership from these countries, they have been also voicing their concerns. Also, many times they are falling on deaf ears. Also, many times just because, as we discussed in the previous lectures, that sometimes when we are geographically distant from these places, or when we are not directly able to see the contact with these communities, we might not be able to understand. But it was really great to see some of these voices at COP26, and hopefully many of their concerns will be included in the agenda going forward, hopefully. So particularly two of the voices that were really kind of prominent in the recent COP26, one of them was Palau Nation's president, Whips. So Whips actually came forward, and the words and the gravity of the matter that was discussed by him, it was really touching for many people who were actually also aware of the fact that how small in number these nations are and the kind of impacts they are going to face. Particularly President Whips, he said that frankly speaking, there is no dignity to show to a slow and painful death. You might as well bomb our islands instead of making us suffer. At the end of the day, that's what we are talking about: extinction of languages, cultures, and people's lives. And why should we accept that? So, as all of you might know, that recently Germany and Canada, they have been assigned with a task force to raise $100 billion for climate adaptation and mitigation strategies, and development of this fund is going to facilitate particularly the developing countries and particularly nations like Pacific Island nations. But the problem is, are we actually serious enough as large scale or the richer westernized nations? Because apparently so far, we have not been able to initiate that funding to a level that it should have been. So these kind of distrust voices and the kind of impacts these communities are already facing, that shows how negative impacts of well-being these nations are already facing. Similarly, we saw that one of the legal advisor for the team of another Pacific Island nation, as we can see over here, Mr. Simon Kofe. He was also really kind of like, coming forward, and instead of flying all the way to Glasgow, he presented his narrative and his stories and the impacts his communities are facing on multiple levels by actually standing from the land of Talawu. And actually these were places where the homes and like, the places of their ancestors were, and now all of that is underwater. Although these are small nations, but because many larger nations, they are not supporting them in the way they should have been supported. So I think this is also a kind of a protest when the presidents or the Pacific Islander nations representatives, they stand on those waters in which their homes have been submerged, and they speak on behalf of their own nations. So in his particular speech, Kofi said that in his islands, particularly in Talawu, there were homes of their ancestors. They are homes of their people today, and they want them to remain the home of their people who will come in future. So as we have discussed in the past, that many of these nations, Pacific Islander nations, and also many of our indigenous communities, their relationship with land and their relationship with the current and the future nations, it's much more stronger and more visible and present in their conversations and narratives. So when these impacts of climate changes are happening, of course, for them, the impact on their emotional well-being, on the psychological well-being, on their the physical health and everything, it has been much more dire compared to many other places in the world. Now, if we think about what's happening on the climate change level, as we have discussed in our previous lectures, we know that there are physical vulnerabilities, there are visible or the direct effects of climate-related changes. We also see that in the last 2 years around the globe, we have seen erratic heat waves, we have seen erratic fires, we have seen flooding that is based on climate change in Holland, in Germany, and throughout the global north to global south, we have been seeing these impacts. Some of these impacts are, of course, slow onset, others are really rapid and fast. And within the BC, we have also seen that these erratic changes, they are impacting our lives on multiple levels. But as I said earlier, the topic for today, it's more about looking at what are the research related findings that we can see, but also in addition to that, what are the more pronounced well-being related or eco-anxiety related impacts that we should be looking at going forward. So when we think of these specific mental health related impacts, particularly the ones that are more pronounced, that are related to psychoteric stress that many people have been experiencing much more, we see that when communities, they are facing more anxiety, they are facing more grief, for example, loss of place, loss of identity. Many people or many communities, when they have to leave their places to migrate to other continents or other countries because of climate change. And of course, as we are going to see more of this happen over the years and over the decades, all of this also causes particular types of stressors and strains on the social relationships, on the community's disruption. And particularly if people are forced to leave the homes where they have grown up, where they have spent all their lives around their communities, it's going to be much more impactful for these communities. And going forward, we are going to need a much larger strategy to develop in order to avoid post-traumatic distress, post-traumatic stress disorders, and many other long-term mental sicknesses, illnesses, and impacts that these communities or many of our own communities are also going to face. So we know that natural disasters, they have indirect impacts, which can also be social or infrastructure related. But these indirect or direct impacts, they always have the tendency to translate into some kind of distress disorders, increased stress levels, And it's not only the person's individual health, but also the health or the well-being of the communities is also going to be disrupted much more than we are already seeing. In that way, it's very important that going forward, we focus much more on the mental health of our communities and of our individuals. As I said, we have seen in many levels that now there is more proposition, but also growing body of research that indicates that more and more people will migrate, and particularly when people are forced to migrate because of losing their places, their livelihoods, or because of any other violence that might also be embedded within the climate change narratives, we see that these people, they are going to experience much higher levels of distress. We are already seeing that the world is closing its borders more than it's opening. And I think with the onset of the recent pandemic and the ongoing pandemics, we are seeing that migration has become one of those bigger issues on which we are seeing a lot of debate. But imagine if world's half of the population has to migrate because there won't be enough livelihoods, or there won't be enough produce to sustain the lives of people. So it's going to be not only distressful for the communities from where people are going to migrate, but also for the communities where these people are going to move forward to. And I think in the recent crises, in different wars and in the pandemic, we have seen that nations, particularly industrialized and rich nations, they are not as welcoming to many refugees and migrants. So how are we going to prepare the world for all the stressors and eco-anxiety that is going to come with all of these migrations that are going to happen in the future? And also, I think it's not only the financial economics related issue. Of course, when people are living their lives in certain communities, they already have figured their life around, and they know how to make sustainable livelihoods. But when they move to new places, there are also intergroup conflicts that exacerbate. And we have seen this in the previous researches and the reviews that have been done by Mendlis and also Miller, and both of these researchers, they came in 2017. And we know that for people, it becomes much harder to not only leave the place. That itself is very stressful, but when they move to the newer places, sometimes the new communities might not be as welcoming. So how do we prepare our nations, our communities for this kind of mindset that in the future we are going to see more global mobility and migration and refugees? So migration research is already indicating that there are very high levels of mental illnesses that are already prevailing in the communities that migrate, particularly people who migrate on involuntary basis, that they didn't want to leave their houses, but they have to. In addition to that, we are seeing that the competition over scarce resources, it's already creating a lot of tension. But then in future, if you are going to see more and more communities being disrupted, there is also going to be more struggle for livelihoods. So in that sense, mental illness or mental health related struggles are not only going to be financial, they're not only going to be ecology or sustainability related, but also just the impacts of violence and the impacts of inter-community or inter-group violence is also going to be much higher than it is at the moment. Just to give you a quick overview, that when we talk about mental health related impacts, there are multiple levels. So they can be embedded in the physical impacts, which translate into later on mental health related impacts. But generally, the physical ones are the ones that have been kind of more pronounced. And also many epidemiological or health-related studies, they have focused much more on them. So for example, whenever we look at the health-related services, they are disrupted during heat waves. If we look at the risk of accidents are also getting more and more increased and pronounced. We also see that whenever there are higher temperatures, we see that all of this translate into higher number of diseases, floods, waterborne diseases, accelerated number of deaths, dehydration, hospitalization, all of these incidents go up. But again, these are the direct physical impacts. What we usually forget to account for whenever we talk about epidemiological studies or global health studies, we tend to forget that all of these factors, they also translate into higher levels of for example, psychological illnesses too. So it's not that straightforward. So of course, it's kind of like, linked. So the physical impacts are also translating into the mental health related impacts. As we discussed in our last lecture, remember that whenever there are floods, whenever there are heat waves, they also trigger many psychological impacts for people when they're not able to cope with those physiological or physical indicators. In a similar way, when we think of climate change also impacts the quality of air that we breathe in. And from even like, in British Columbia, here in Vancouver, big chunk of our 2020, and particularly during the fire seasons, we saw that the air quality was so low, and it was much more hazardous, although like, the air quality and the health and well-being indices of the city and generally British Columbia are much better than rest of the world. But during these days, we saw the impacts. But then imagine, because of the climate change and particularly because of the higher levels of emissions, we are seeing that the quality of air around the world has been going down, and because of the particles or the particulate matter that have been going high. Some of the worst cities to live in the world at the moment, they are based in the global south. So it's not just that, like, the air quality is worse in some parts of the world, but also the countries that are least contributors in these emissions. These are countries that are not contributing towards the climate change. These are also the countries and places in the cities where we see the highest negative impacts of air quality. And we see that when it comes to health-related impacts, of course, there are physical health-related impacts we see, which are on the short term, or there are also the long-term impacts, for example, asthma or cancer. But we have seen that it's not just the physical or the physiological impacts, but there is a much stronger and pronounced cognitive component that we have seen in Yorifuji or Kashima's research. Also, much of the research that has been happening in East Asia and in the global south, that also indicates that it's not only the physical or the behavioral changes that we see, but also there is a big chunk of research that indicates now that there is cognitive impairment that is an impact of this poor air quality. So going forward, when we think about making the impacts of climate change more pronounced, I think mental health and the cognitive health of people, it has to be accounted for when we think of future indicators of climate change. Because at the moment, I think we are more focused on adaptation and mitigation, but that human factor is kind of still weaker or mostly missing as well. Also, I think one major line of research that has focused on the mental health impact of children and also younger people, we have seen that more vulnerable people and particularly children, they are coming more under the direct impact of climate change. We are seeing the stronger responses to extreme weather events. Also, younger people, they are getting more distressed. So because they are usually dependent on older people in the family. If they are stressed, the younger children, they show higher and more pronounced negative impacts such as PTSD, depression, or sleep disorders. We have also seen that because these younger people, especially children, they're still in their phases of development, and their body and their cognitive development is not fully complete yet. So the stress on their mental health and the stress on the physical health, it can be much larger, particularly when it comes to trauma, when it comes to their ability to regulate their emotions, because they do not have well-developed emotional response available to them. So it can become much more challenging for the parents and also particularly for the children themselves. So when we think of reasons for mental health impacts, we know that there are multiple levels of threats, and we have discussed in the past that in some places these direct impacts are translating directly into stronger levels of mental health related impacts. But also we know that in many places, even if people do not have direct contact with climate change, if they have and let's say like social media available to them, media available to them, they already know these kinds of impacts. So it's not necessary that I have to lose a home, I have to migrate, I have to become a refugee in order to experience what kind of negative impacts on my well-being are going to be. But also it's much more than that. So in fact, when people are displaced from their places, and when we look at them, so for example, in a vicarious environment or in vicarious learning, we know that these kinds of impacts, they are going to have a much larger influence on the mental well-being of these people who are just vicarious learners of such events as well. So as an environmental stressor, we know that climate change has some of the distinctive attributes. We know in this current pandemic in COVID-19, we have seen how our vulnerabilities are also multi-level, multi-scalar, and they also interact on multiple levels. So it is a real threat. So it is rational to experience some worry. Of course, it is important to understand what's happening in the globe, what's happening around us, but also it's something that is still ongoing, it's still developing, and we also need to focus on adaptation. So if we are solely focused on some of these negative reasons to worry about our climate and about these impacts, it's not going to let us move forward and develop some of the mitigation strategies. So there is a lot of uncertainty, and we know that this uncertainty is something for which we need to develop more stronger response. But again, this uncertainty is also the one that leads to our mental vulnerability towards mental health related negative impacts. And again, I think one of the other reason that it's important for us to know that it's a significant threat to our global well-being as a human, as a species. Also, I think it's important to highlight that when it comes to mental health and well-being, of course, it's deeply linked with our own awareness of threat, of not being able to exist. So that existential or terror management theory related threats, all of that makes us much more vulnerable. And especially if climate change is an impact that is happening on a global scale, the scale of climate change is much larger than this pandemic, any other pandemic that has happened in the past, and it's just starting to unfold. So in that sense, I think we need to gear up, we need to prepare ourselves to prepare for what's coming next. And for that, we need to focus more on the motivational side. So as in the last lecture, Dr. Mudassir mentioned that it's a stronger motivation to survive compared to the motivation to worry about these existential threats that are going to loom around for much longer time. So when it comes to emotional response to environmental degradation, it's also very important for us to know that initially we didn't have, of course, like, a lot of terminologies for what is the negative or the emotional or the well-being related impact of climate change on us. But now I think over time, thanks to the work of Australian philosopher Glenn Albrecht, and based on his work, we have been able to define and articulate what it means when we are stressed out, what it means when we say that our ecological environment around us is also negatively impacting our well-being. So in that whole framework of defining or trying to understand what kind of stressors we are facing, Albrecht's work has tried to translate these psychoteric syndromes, which are basically like, our emotional response to the sensory experience that is around us within our ecologies. So there are basically four syndromes, and all of them, they have their own specificities. For example, the first one is solastalgia. The second one is eco-paralysis. The third one is eco-anxiety, and eco-anxiety is the generic term that we use quite a lot, and we have discussed this in, like, plenty of research on climate change. And this is one of the most important one because, like, it covers many other domains within these syndromes. And the last one is eco-nostalgia. So if we look at all of them one by one, so basically, solastalgia is our chronic distress or our chronic highest level of stress that we feel or we experience in response to negative environmental changes, particularly when it affects our home environment. So basically, like, when we think of a home, a place, or our let's say even, like, generally our globe, that heightened sense of distress that we experience, that's related to solastalgia. The second one is eco-paralysis, and eco-paralysis, as you can imagine, as the name says, it's basically some kind of inability, like the stress or the distress is so high that it makes us kind of crippled, right? So an inability to act on environmental challenges due to a perception that it's kind of like, intractable. So it's not kind of going away, it's only going to become larger, it's only going to expand. So all of this anxiety, and particularly when we are consuming a lot of media which is focusing on this doom and gloom, that leads to a lot of eco paralysis as well. Not necessarily that people don't want to do anything about it, but sometimes people might be stressed to such a point that it might be harder for them to think about taking action or doing something particular to, like, fixing the environment or fixing these components in the environment. The third component is eco-anxiety. It's also about distress, but more about the fear or dreadedness, which is associated with negative environmental information more generally. So also, whenever we are consuming a lot of negative information, let's say on Twitter, on Instagram, or on, like, any other social media forum, particularly now we are more used to watching a lot of footage or video content, that can also create a lot of eco-anxiety. And not necessarily that you are going to be part of, like, directly experiencing these negative impacts, but generally too, even when you are consuming, it can have a huge negative impact on your well-being. The other element is about eco-nostalgia. Eco-nostalgia is really about the stress that we face, and it's based on a perception that our geographical location, it was better than what it is now. So it's really being hooked in the past and constantly thinking that how our place or our ancestors' place was. Also the kind of stories that we hear from our relatives, our elderly, or our ancestors, all of these oral histories that we know about our climate or about our geography, these are very different. So for example, someone who comes from a farmer's family in India, they would be able to tell you that their local environment was much more produce friendly. It was much more predictable about even 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. But now, over time, because of the erratic weather patterns, it's also become very stressful for these people. So all the local knowledge that their ancestors or their elderly were able to use, now the new generations are not able to use that, just because that the climate change has changed our geography to a level that even as, like, the first, second, or third generation, we are able to see, or we are able to understand the kind of changes that have happened in our environment, in our immediate environment. So in that sense, I think it's super important that when people share their experience about eco-nostalgia, let's say when someone is coming from, like, somewhere in the global south, and they share their experience, we need to be better listeners in order to um, lower their levels of stress or their distress levels. So all of these syndromes, why do we call them syndrome? We call them syndromes because they are so large, they are so grave, and they are so multidimensional. There are multiple reasons within these distresses or these stresses having an onset into our mental space or impacting our mental well-being. That's why these syndromes, they are becoming more and more pronounced in our lives. Therefore, it's a very important contribution from Albrecht that we now have these terminologies. At least we know when we are facing eco-anxiety, we know when we are facing eco-nostalgia, or even paralysis, or solastalgia. So in that sense, I think these contributions of researchers are very important. Then it's also very important to know for us that emotional response to environmental degradation that has been around us for a while. So it's not that we needed these sets of terminologies and only then we started doing our research on these issues. But researchers, for example, Searle and Gao, also Dorothy and Clayton, around, like, 2010 and 2011, they started doing research on the emotional or the negative responses that people are already experiencing based on the climate-based, climate-related changes that are happening. Most of this research actually started in Australia because that's where we started to see a lot of droughts happening, loss of crops, more erratic fires, and more erratic rain patterns, or rains disappearing for longer periods of time. So we have seen that whenever people were experiencing climate-related distress, or whenever some of these erratic weather patterns were happening, people would experience higher levels of anxiety and hopelessness. So these emotional responses, these were kind of the first ones that were being recorded at that time. And overall, these researchers were also able to see that whenever these erratic weather patterns or climate-related distresses were happening, people would also experience much higher levels of depression, anxiety, and also in Australia, we have seen that many times suicide has, like, an ecoteric motive, where people are distressed about the uncertainty about their climate-related changes, particularly intense emotions that are associated with observations of climate changes, and particularly people who are under the direct impact of climate change. For them, these kinds of emotions, these are not just generic syndromes, but for them, these have direct well-being related negative consequences. And also in these models, particularly the one by Clayton, and Clayton has done a lot of research over the years, we have seen that the model of psychological impacts that works with multiple moderators or mediators, what kind of direct impacts there are. So, for example, whenever people are consuming more social media, and they have more social media related representations available to them, and also their vulnerabilities based on their social strata. So, for example, people who are poorer in their socioeconomic status, they have lower capacity to cope with such kind of climate-related vulnerabilities. So if their coping resources are lower, that also moderates in the prevalence of this kind of depression, anxiety, suicide, and stress-related impacts for these communities. Also, we see that over time there has been more organized research that continues to happen, particularly when we see that it's not just hopelessness, or it's not just distress, or it's not depression only, but also there is a stronger prevalence of fear. Particularly Clayton's work, it shows that there is not only grief or hopelessness or anxiety, but we are now also seeing there is a lot of fear, and we know that fear also translates into anger. So when communities are going through a lot of anxiety and hopelessness and grief, they also feel angry when their leaders are not doing enough, or at least people don't feel that their leaders are doing enough. So all of that also has a huge impact on these communities. We see that both automatic or non-conscious responses, as well as a higher order controlled reflection. So multiple lines of research have shown that whenever we see that there is heightened sensitivity to potential problems that are embedded in climate change, we see that these triggers or these climate-related events, they lead to these emotional responses. And if there is no effective action being taken by the leaders in a country, in a community, then this also translates into a lot of fear and sometimes also anger. Then in Australian context particularly, we have seen that there is now a much larger body of research starting from as back as 2006, where they're using multiple environmental distress scales. So over the years, they're measuring what are the level of stress and how they also kind of get spikes. For example, whenever there is forest fires, or whenever there are floods, or whenever there are no rains happening. So in those kinds of events, having these standardized scales, particularly, for example, Higginbotham's work and the colleagues' work, it shows that over the years, whenever there are devastating impacts happening. So for example, recently when there were fires in Australia, we saw that these communities are not only threatened, but they have enormous negative emotional impact, which leads to a lot of ecoteric anxiety or eco-anxiety in these communities. So their iconic landscape is changing fast. So for example, Great Reef Barrier is losing a lot of important species in the ocean. Similarly, lots of important iconic animals in the forest, they have died in the recent fires, literally millions of them. And according to some estimates, more than 40% of these animals, they have been lost forever. So it's important to know that whenever there are direct linkages or direct visible impacts in these communities, those impacts last for much longer, and we need to be more prepared to offer such services in the future, because it's going to be around for much longer time, and probably like in many places, for example, in Amazon, for example, in Australia, even here in BC, we have seen in the recent years, these impacts are going to be much more grave, which means that we need more human support to provide well-being related support to our people and to our communities. Another very important research that compares how it's not just like, the direct impact on certain communities that leads to their concerns. For example, like, if we ask people how concerned they are about climate change, and also that can be referred to as global warming, we see that it's not just that when people are in those particular areas where these floods are happening, where these fires are happening, but also beyond that, people have a strong impact of that. So for example, we just saw that in Glasgow, we had COP26. So it's not just a coincidence, but also these countries, these nations, they're much more at the forefront and at the center of building global perceptions about climate change. Even if we talk about Sir David Attenborough or many other climate activists, they are based out of not only Australia, but mostly also within the UK. So we see that much of the work that has been done by Joe Resser and their colleagues, it indicates that in the large national surveys, of course, we see that there is a much more negative impact, and also, of course, understanding of the gravity of the issue of climate change. But what we more specifically also see, that when we ask the same question or the similar question to the UK audience as well, which are not either like, under the direct impacts of the floods or the fires, but still the perception or the sensitivity to these issues and how close they are in our global understanding and in our global perceptions. As you can see over here in these graphs, we see that actually, like, the light gray bars, these are the ones for the UK, and the darker ones are for Australia. So of course, in Australia, like, people are concerned, and these percentages are really skyrocketing and sky high. But even like, when you see them in comparison to the UK, they are not statistically significantly different, which means that doesn't matter where you are in the world. Now people are so well connected through social media and through other portals and forums, that when it comes to the negative impacts on the well-being, we are all being impacted. And I think it's also very important for building that empathy, for building that common understanding of our issues as humans in this world. So I think in that sense, probably it's the only thing that is going to help us going forward, when we want to build a common understanding for all of us, and when we want to reach out and help out to all the communities. So if there is no empathy, of course, we are not going to be able to support climate refugees. We are not going to be able to support people through providing the social support or well-being support or clinical support that people might need, and people deserve that. Not only in the UK and in Australia, but also beyond that, when we look at the world, and when we look at the research that is coming from all around the world, we are able to see that roughly, like, similar percentage of people, which is roughly between 20s and 30s, across the Europe, across the countries, we are able to see that these statistics are relatively more stable. And actually, like, Europe is not the hotspot for a lot of erratic weather patterns or for a lot of fires or floods, but still there too people are very worried, which means, like, from a scale of 1 to 5, probably people are more worried around the scale of 4. And this is, I think, again, as I said earlier, it's very important for our empathy and for our connectedness with other people, so that we can support them when they need any kind of support from us. Also, when we think of the nationally representative surveys of nations that are more vulnerable, there, of course, we see much larger impacts. For example, when we think of Greenland, when we think of Iceland, when we go to our own northern territories here in Canada, closer to home, we also see that the percentages, they become much larger. For example, 38% of Greenlanders, they are roughly moderately worried, or like strongly worried or concerned about that. But also, it doesn't only mean that they are worried, but that also translates into things such as sadness, strong hopelessness. So that these are the factors that probably more strongly impact the communities which are seeing these direct impacts, compared to many of us or many of the European people who are not directly seeing these impacts. Also, I think earlier we also discussed, I showed you some footage from Tuvalu, Tuvalu. Yeah, so Tuvalu, the one of the Pacific Island nations, which is at a risk of, like, highest risk of climate change, and we are seeing that it's not just like 20s or 30s. It's 95% of the people who are extremely distressed about climate change, and it's despairing all of their functionality. So if you are losing land, if you are losing all the livelihoods that's dependent on the land on which these people live, if that's sinking at the fastest rate around the globe, of course, it's one of those doomsday scenario which is really translating and unfolding in front of our eyes. So again, whenever we see that the direct impacts are happening on certain nations, on certain communities, of course, the level of distress that is reported by these nations, the level of mental health issues or well-being issues that is reported by these nations, it's much higher compared to nations that still feel that they have some control over their environment, or nations that feel that well, their countries are rich and they might be able to find a way out of this. And as you know, that when we talk about climate change related mitigation and adaptation strategies, particularly in adaptation, most of our adaptation strategies are also futuristic. We are planning and we are thinking that probably in next 20 years or so, we'll be able to develop this and this and this strategy, and those inventions and those strategies that are going to save our planet, and we are still going to sustain it. But the nations which are already losing their land, which are already losing their communities, where people are already becoming climate refugees and climate migrants, for them, it's now or never. So there we see almost 95 to 100% of the population is extremely under distress, or these people have very high negative well-being related impacts. So it's important that, like, we acknowledge and we understand the distress the nations like Tuvalu or Palau are facing in Pacific Islander nations. Moreover, when we talk about climate anxiety, this is one of those terminologies that I think APA, American Psychological Association, has done a wonderful job. American Psychological Association was at the forefront early in 2010 onwards, report after report, they have been talking about stress in America. And I think it's super important that even like, about 11 years ago when they started to launch their initial reports, they were very concerned about what's happening to the climate and how the climate is getting impacted by all the changes that are happening, but more importantly, how that translates into the stress in their communities, which is growing, and it continues to go to higher levels. In the more recent studies in 2018, which was also shared in 2020 report of American Psychological Association, it shows that 51% of respondents, they list climate change as a somewhat significant source of stress. And you can imagine that it's also a nation which is very divided, where there is also a big chunk of population which thinks that climate change is not real. They are also deniers of climate change, just like vaccine or the pandemic or the existence of the COVID-19 virus. So in that sense, I think these numbers are huge. They show something that even in countries where, like, the impacts are not that big, or at least for now, they're not that visible, the large population, or almost like, half of the population, thinks that these impacts are real, and these impacts are the significant source of stress for these nations. Also, just in 2020, the report that came more recently, there was another survey that found that about two-thirds, which is in 2020, around 75% of Americans, they reported that they felt eco-anxiety. And in these modern surveys now, we are using the term eco-anxiety quite a bit. And eco-anxiety in this context, it was defined as the anxiety or worry that these people felt about climate change and its effects. And about one quarter, which is like, the remaining 25% of them, they said that they felt a lot of eco-anxiety. So more recently, I think year after year, when we are going back to these surveys and we are rerunning them, we are seeing that more and more people understand it, more and more people believe it, because they're able to see a lot of erratic changes in the global weathers, in the global patterns, in the global heat waves, in the cold waves, and also in the sense how fires are happening. Also, it's important to note that anxiety itself does not indicate a problem with mental health. And this is also the standpoint that APA, American Psychological Association, has taken. It is important to know that, okay, that this is a concern, but we cannot pathologize it. We need to think of, like, the source of these stressors and how to mitigate those stresses, rather than thinking of it as something that is pathological. And we only need to think of the clinical solutions, so that all the people, they end up in like, counseling offices, and not basically like, talking about the adaptation and mitigation that needs to be done. So it's also a big issue of leadership. It's not just like, the issue of reporting anxiety into different scales and into different variables. So in other places in the world, now we know that media is something that is like, going fast, which is going around all the contents that are being produced in the North or in the global South. All of them, they're traveling faster than ever before. So climate change has also become a culturally construed threat. And again, it's not just like, in certain cultures, but across the globe now we see that it's one of those unequal constructs that have developed over time. But like, nonetheless, those who are least equal, or those who are under the highest impact, they don't even have many of these terminologies. For example, for eco-anxiety, people might tell you that, well, their houses are being demolished because of the, let's say, urban flooding and other things happening, but they might not have these terminologies. So those nations which are still like, under the lower impact, those are the ones who actually have better terminologies to deal with these issues and to talk about these issues. When we talk about the cultural context, it also has the potential to contribute to the occurrence of climate related anxiety. So it's also like, something that we need to talk about. But when we are constantly talking about the anxiety and the impacts and not about the mitigation and the adaptation related strategies, these framings, they can also trigger like, certain kinds of anxieties, particularly through the media representations. As we know that media representations are more likely to play a larger part in determining people's perceptions. So I think in addition to talking about all the risks and all the vulnerabilities that we are going to face, or we are going to be prepared to cope with, it's also important to talk about, like, the social context where we are, and how being the more privileged ones, we need to also support the movement. So for example, as Canadians, we are one of the richest nations in the world. So if there are debates, or if there are like, conversations, we need to support our governments, our leaderships, in taking the agenda for, let's say, raising money for the adaptation and mitigation plans. For example, that $100 billion funds that is going to be endorsed across the world. And again, mostly rich nations, they have to support these kinds of, like, global fundraise. So in our own capacity, I think not only getting stuck in that lingo of thinking about eco-anxiety, because we have these spaces and these terminologies, but also thinking about how moving forward we can support the nations that do not have these capacities. So this, like, culturally constructed construals, they also needs to be challenged. We can't just think that, well, now we know all these uh, verbosity of words and constructs, and we apply it only to ourselves. We know that there are more marginalized countries and nations and communities in the world who might be needing much more support than just, like, the cultural construals that we are creating for them as researchers, as scientists, or as, like, people who study science, such as psychology. Then when we think about climate change and mental illness, generally speaking, as I said earlier, this ecological stress, it's there. So yes, we need to think about, like, how to engage with more mitigation and adaptation strategies, but also we need to think about, like, there are places in the world, particularly in Australia, people who are dependent on the farming, or on, like, raising their cattle, and these, rather than living in more industrialized notions of livelihoods. For them, the rates of depression and of suicide, they are going high. And we also see similar patterns. Not, they are not well researched, but the speculations are, if we do research, we are going to find similar things. So for example, in India, in global south generally, many places where people are not able to sustain their cattle, when they are, the people are not able to sustain their not only livestock, but also their farming strategies, because local knowledge is becoming irrelevant in many places. Then there too, people are prone to more depression and suicide. So when we think of, like, climate adaptation funds, we really need to prioritize these nations, instead of, like, making it our own Western cultural agenda of talking about only our own communities. Of course, our communities are important, and particularly mostly indigenous communities who are being more like, strongly impacted. But I think in addition to that, we need to think more also globally too. So in the United States, we have also seen that the ecological stress, it's kind of like, becoming much more pronounced. But again, the depressive symptoms, they happen to be more often in communities that are more marginalized, communities that are more closely linked with farming practices, where they need to rely on, like, the climate related stabilities. So again, going back to the argument that we were making earlier, the more directly exposed you are to climate related changes for your livelihoods, for your life, for your practices, for your direct households, the more negative well-being related or eco-anxiety related impacts people are going to face. Here, when we look at climate anxiety, it's very important to see that in indigenous communities, we have been able to see a much stronger impact. If we look at Inuit hunters or people who are, like, in the northern communities of Labrador or many other northern communities, we will discuss them later on as well. In the indigenous communities, they have become, or they have been rendered most vulnerable. If we look at our Arctic and our northern communities, they are 3 times more negatively impacted because of climate changes compared to many of our mainland communities that live here, let's say in southern BC or lower mainland and many other places within Canada. So when we think about some of these impacts that indigenous communities are more vulnerable to, we see that when it comes to their cultural identity, it's changing fast. So for example, their cultural identity is deeply embedded with land. And if, like, the land and the kind of landscapes and livelihoods that they are dependent upon, if it is changing fast, of course, there is a higher level of stress due to impacts on their livelihoods, on their finances. We also see that the indigenous cultures, they are being disrupted, and their dependence on the wildlife in those communities, that is a very core part of their indigenous cultures. So in many of these places, particularly in the coastal areas, also in the northern areas, when we see that there is a lot of depletion happening in the glaciers or in many of other livelihoods. For example, in this picture, as we can see that there is an Inuit hunter, and like, because of breakage on their, like, frozen lands, many times their animals or their livestock, it's also falling into these waters where it is not supposed to fall. It has to be more stabilized surface. So we see that it's a very distress or anxiety provoking phenomenon that these people are facing more and more now. So because of many of these changes that are happening, there is a perceived increase in substance abuse. We are also seeing that in many of these indigenous communities, there is higher suicide ideation that is happening in these communities. So it's like, a multi-level, multi-scalar approach that needs to be developed on national level and also on community level. So when we see that certain communities, particularly our indigenous communities, if they are more vulnerable, we need to prioritize them, and we need to shift more resources and more climate-related adaptation and also mitigation that serves these communities, because they are the ones who are most vulnerable. Similarly, when we look at the National Inuit Climate Strategy and their reports that were published in 2019, they show that among the Inuit peoples in Canada, the climate change is linked to the reported increase in substance abuse and suicidal ideation. And again, like, initially when psychological models were predicting, these were just predictions, but now we are seeing that research is backing all of these assumptions assumptions up, we see that if you look at some of these mechanisms. So when there are changes in the sea ice, and how their livelihoods are dependent on these sea ice, we see that it's also the issue of leadership within our communities, not the indigenous one, but the outside one, for example, the national leadership plans, where we really need to focus on decreasing the industrial activity. So if we know that industrial activities are destroying the livelihoods of our indigenous communities, how hard it has to be that we don't stop these mass scale industrial excavations that are happening into these indigenous communities. Also, there are dire impacts on Arctic fish and wildlife. We also see that because of these changes happening, traditional knowledge is no longer relevant. As I said earlier, that if the climate is not predictable and people who live in these more exposed and wild places, for them, their traditional local knowledge is everything. So, for example, as we saw in the previous slide, if someone's hunting dogs and hunting crew is going to be more at risk, they might not consider going for hunting. So what are the alternates that we are offering to our communities? And in some places, we don't need alternates. We just need to have stronger mitigation strategies. We need to have stronger mitigation plans so that we can be more inclusive in serving these communities going forward. Also, when we see changes to access to the Arctic fish and wildlife, there are very strong impacts on humans. So if we take away livelihoods, if we take away the traditional knowledge that many of these communities base themselves on, what kind of well-being will be left with these communities? So I think it is very important that we focus on how better we can serve these communities, how to include them, and how to base our own learning to kind of use the local knowledge, use the traditional knowledge in order to avert all the negative impacts that we are bringing with climate change, particularly with the mining industry, with the increased industrial activity, for example, shipping, tourism, and many other things that we are doing in very vulnerable, very fragile communities of our indigenous peoples. So in that sense, I think it's very important that we recognize that some of the solutions might already be there. We are just looking away from these solutions, particularly when it comes to traditional knowledge and the traditional ways of doing things when it comes to fishing, when it comes to hunting, when it comes to looking after our Arctic wildlife and Arctic fish stock and many other things. So therefore, I think there is a lot that we can learn from our indigenous communities. One very interesting model that was presented by Willox and colleagues in that model, they really focus on what is the landscape, what is the ecosystem, the geological features, and the hydrological processes and geography that is embedded in land, and how indigenous people, they have a very close, very strong relationship with land. Therefore, when we think of the socio and a historical or the cultural context, it is very important that we don't undermine the significance that land has for many indigenous communities in order to ensure their mental health and their well-being. So for example, when we take away the opportunities to use land for hunting, for trapping, for foraging, for fishing, for traveling, and many other things that are directly linked with the changes that are happening in their lifestyle, especially in the northern communities, particularly Inuit people. We see that there are many detrimental impacts on the mental health of these communities, just because we are changing all of these livelihood related strategies for these people, and we are not leaving any alternate for them, because their relationship with land is very special, and the way of codependence that they have created for themselves, it's incredible. So instead of learning and instead of basing our learning on them, we are actually just causing more trouble for them and for their mental health. So for example, if people in these communities, if they don't have the autonomy, the efficacy of working on their land as hunters, as trappers, as for engaged in their livestock being engaged in foraging, there is a loss of sense of purpose. And we know that the emotional impact, the physical impact, and in addition to that, the purpose that people have associated with land and with livelihoods, if we take that away, what kind of psychological impacts we are going to leave them with? We are going to undermine their resilience. They are already living in very tough physical environment, but again, they have co-adapted with their environment, and they have developed certain dependence that we are trying to undermine as as consumers, or as people who in one way or another many times also end up supporting mining and other industries that are ecologically very damaging for these people, and hence also mental health wise and well-being wise very damaging for these communities. So in that sense, I think it's important that we understand the relationship that these people have with the land. So I would highly encourage all of you to have a look into the papers and look at the details of this study into your learning materials as well. Also, it's very important to see that when we think of climate change related impacts, there is the climate anxiety, but it's not just very straightforward. But we think that there are cognitive impairment related impacts, which means that when people are thinking about the climate change, it makes them difficult. It makes it difficult for them to go to sleep, and sometimes it can be very distress causing. So cognitive space is many times occupied for people, particularly Clayton and Karasia's work shows that it's not just the cognitive impairment, that people have this cognitive load that constantly makes them more anxious, more worried, but there is also a functional impairment. So it's not just certain cognition, certain ideas about eco-anxiety that people have, but we see now that more and more people are concerned that this eco-anxiety is not just a mental thing now, it's actually translating to their behavioral impairment, their functional impairment. And in many of the studies, and particularly the one that Susan Clayton has recently done, it shows that there is a negative emotional response related to climate change, and it translates, all the studies show consistently, that there is a stronger cognitive impairment, and there is also stronger functional impairment. Moreover, the climate change and the emotional responses, they are also more closely translating into higher levels of anxiety and higher levels of depression. And we see that it's literally this climate change happening, the impacts, the visibility of these climate related changes and the impacts, the cognitive understanding of people that, okay, these impacts are impacting their mental well-being, and then it translates into higher levels of anxiety and depression, which is directly and strongly associated with further cognitive impairment and further functional impairment of these people. So this is not just some mental or the cognitive load that people are facing, but it actually translates into much stronger, more dire functional impairment related effects in people. When we think of who is who is experiencing such climate anxiety. So in this aspect, if we look at the research that is coming, let's say from the US, or it's coming from the global south, wherever we go, we are always seeing that it's more common among people who are actually more worried about the climate. So people who take climate seriously, people who are concerned, they are the ones who are facing it more often. But Ojala and many other researchers now indicate that these impacts are much more pronounced in children, because children are people who are dependent on older adults in the families. And if older adults are stressed, children are much more prone to higher levels of depression if they see their elder being more worried or distressed. Also, we have seen that people who have certain personality traits, they are the ones who might have higher levels of stress. So depending on how people's personalities are, I think it is important to keep an eye around on people who you feel that they are more neurotic, or who have more psychiatric or other psychological disorders. So for example, people who have certain negative proneness to negative emotions, or proneness to higher levels of fear or phobias or anxieties, they might feel higher impacts of psychological well-being too. So it's not just the personality, but as I said earlier, more younger people are, and if they understand the climate change, actually they face much more negative impact. But it really depends if people have this deeper understanding that climate is something about which they can do something. If they are motivated enough to undertake any changes, actually that agency, that autonomy, or that self-regulation, as we discussed in the self-determination theory, and also undermining this whole terror management theory that it's all doom and gloom, those people can actually survive better. And these people are the ones who can buffer some negative impacts of this climate anxiety. So it's not a very straightforward equation. So yes, people who will have direct exposure to negative impacts of climate change, of course, they will face higher levels of eco-anxiety. And also people who are younger, they will face higher levels of eco-anxiety. But in addition to that, we also see that there are certain personalities. But at the end, it all comes to the autonomy, the independence, or the competence that people will feel that they can contribute to some change in their environment. So for example, if you're working on a project where you are thinking about how to reduce your meat consumption, how to, let's say, reduce having more children, or how to reduce your impact on, let's say, use of cars or any other thing that contributes to the emissions, or taking transatlantic flights, for example. So all of that contributes to certain level of competence, certain level of resiliency in people, which will eventually translate into lower eco-anxiety. So as long as you are trying to do something about eco-anxiety, you actually have a better chance of getting a buffer. You have a better chance of fighting against this anxiety, compared to just sitting there and worrying about what it is going to bring, and thinking about that doom and gloom scenario that many times we continue to face and experience. As I said earlier, that when we think about the climate anxiety and behavior, the climate anxiety could serve as a source of motivation. So as long as we have, taken an initiative, we are trying to do some changes into our environment, it will ward away any kind of eco paralysis that many people might face. So when people are in that fear mode, into that anxiety mode, at that time, most of the time, they're not able to engage in anything except for being worried about the fear that they are facing, or the fear that they are having. So in that sense, I think it is super important to understand that when you are doing something, when you are trying to build more motivation, and that's why people who who engage with activism, sometimes, of course, they're frustrated, they're angry, they have they have grievances with the leadership and with many other people. But ego paralysis is not something that they would face. And anxiety in these activists, that it actually tends to be much lower. Also, we know that distress about climate change, it's a strong predictor of adaptation, right? So let's say if you're not empathizing with other communities, if you're not feeling that it is something that is worthy of change, it is not something, if you don't feel that you need to worry about something, then you're not going to take any adaptation measures, right? So the large scale mitigation measures, they're actually up to the governments or the governance structures. But when it comes to individual behavior, when you're more engaged in adaptive behavior, you're also less likely to be stressed out. You're also less likely to be anxious. So in that sense, when you are doing something, when you're trying to reduce eco-anxiety amongst your peers, and you are talking to other people about doing something, actually you will experience lower levels of eco-anxiety. Just to elaborate a little bit more, in 2019, AP, American Psychological Association's survey that was published later in 2020, people who reported eco-anxiety were twice as likely, for example, around 87%, compared to those who did not. For example, 40% who say that they are motivated to change their behavior in order to reduce the contribution to climate change, right? So basically, if you are more engaged into doing something for climate change, you might feel sometimes also anxious, worried, or even angry, but you will have more meaning, and that meaning sometimes also ends up creating more buffer for you, so that you are less stressed and you actually feel more impactful. But if the meaning is missing, if people feel that the actions that they are taking, they don't have any impact, which is genuinely not true. But when people feel that their actions have an impact, so that's why I think psychologically it's very important, even if you contribute in a smallest possible way, you think and you give yourself this constant recognition that your behavior and the behaviors that you are changing, they have an impact. So that actually translates into a much more positive impact for you, for the climate, and also you buffer these negative impacts of anxiety. Additionally, we also see that using perhaps more stringent definition of anxiety, the climate anxiety was neither positively nor negatively associated with behavior. So basically, it's the association of meaning. If you associate the meaning of doing something positive, or positively contributing to your environment, so that you can diminish some of the impacts of climate change around you, it actually lowers your anxiety. So it's actually the game of meaning, more than just having an impact of anxiety or no anxiety. So also it's important that we reflect a state of tension between motivating and paralyzing effects. What it means is that the relationship is not that straightforward. So when people are struggling, when people are striving for any change, they might be angry, they might also be anxious at that time. But there might be also other times when people actually feel down. They feel that, well, we are not doing enough, and they might feel some kind of paralysis. A good example of that would be, for example, at COP26 this week, towards the closing session, many people were who were very vocal, very angry, who were really pushing forward the agenda, when they saw that some of the people, they were not doing enough, or when they saw that some of the leaders who had a lot of power, they did not deliver on their promises. Many people also felt some kind of paralysis. So again, it's not a constant state. So if you feel eco anxiety, also be aware that things are going to change. So it's not something that is constant. So having that mindset that it's not something that is going to be there forever, or being in that eco paralysis mindset, that also is not going to last forever. So in whichever state people are, if it impacts their well-being in a negative way, I think it's a good reminder for us to know that this is not constant. It is also going to change. So if climate is changing, if negative impacts are happening, but so is our adaptation strategy, so is our mitigation strategy, so is our willingness to change, to survive, to modify, and also to demand our right as, like, safe survivors on this planet. So this is one of the research that builds a very elaborate model. This was done by Higginbotham and Calise in 2014. This research is also mentioned in one of the paper that we have assigned for this week's readings. We see that when people experience any kind of direct or indirect impact of global warming or climate change, people are not directly thinking about, like, adaptation, or about collective action, or about individual action, or about mitigation. There are multiple pathways through which people live through these direct or indirect experiences. So the first step is literally the attribution. So for example, what is it that people attribute? So our anxiety is more pronounced when we are able to associate these impacts with the human activities. So for example, if we think that, well, nature has its course, after every 100 or 200 years later, we are going to see certain heat waves or strong floods, etc., then our appraisal is also going to be impacted by that. So I mean, depending on if we think that the climate change is attributable to the natural cycles or to the human activities, that is going to translate into different kinds of threat appraisal. Either people are going to be like, super deniers that, well, it doesn't exist and I don't believe in it. It's just a natural cycle. Or people, when they think that it's like, human related activities, they think about their response, they think about their efficacy, they think about their collective efficacy, that like every individual's action matter, and how all of us together can motivate ourselves more towards some problem focused coping of this problem, which will translate into, let's say, our own collective and self protection, also our emotional expression. So let's say even if we are stressed, it would mean that we associate that stress with the human activities, which means that we are going to be able to participate in the adaptation or in the individual and the collective actions for making these kinds of changes. So in that sense, I think it's very important. And in addition to that, the emotional responses, for example, our concern, our fear, our anger, our anxiety, our guilt, that's also something that kind of like, mediates these relationships in a way that if we don't feel emotionally connected with the kind of impact our human activities are having on our climate, we are not going to be sensitive, we are not going to be empathic, we are not going to be focused on solving this problem. So imagine someone who believes that natural cycles of nature, they are the ones who are responsible for global warming or direct or indirect impacts of climate change. For them, dismissing or denying is going to be an automatic response, and we are done, right? On the other hand, people who are sensitive, people who are more understanding, or like, who have read, understood this work more, they know that it's anthropogenic. So the human activities are the ones that are leading to these impacts. So also because of that human connectedness, they will feel emotional. So that emotional response, it's kind of like, also one of the blessing, because if we don't have that emotional response, if we don't have that eco-anxiety, if we don't have that worry about our planet, then we are not going to participate in any kind of adaptation or mitigation related impacts. So I think in that sense, we also need to be grateful for our sensibilities and for our emotional response to everything that we see happening around us or far away from us. So independent of the psychological or the geographical distance that might be between us, we are still able to emotionally connect, and hence we are able to participate in adaptation and in individual level and in the collective action to stop climate change from exacerbating its impacts. So yeah, in the next part of the lecture, we are going to talk about climate anxiety. So we will resume from here shortly. So yeah, stay tuned for the next lecture. Thank you. Thank you.